They called her just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling Mercer said when she walked past his office at 6:48 a.m. on a Tuesday, her hands already moving through the hospital before most people had finished their coffee. Natalie Hayes didn't hear the words, she never did. She was already 3 floors above him, checking the cardiac unit supply inventory, her movements precise as a military formation. He had no idea what those hands had done. He had no idea that the woman restocking saline bottles outside protocol had once tied off a bleeding femoral artery under mortar fire while calling in medevac coordinates through a radio that crackled with Pashto accents and outgoing rounds. She didn't know, either, that Dr. Mercer had already opened a file on her. But the real secret, the one that would matter in exactly 5 years, was that someone was about to recognize her. St. Michael's cardiac unit smelled like antiseptic and rain. The morning shift had just started, and the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby above patient rooms that stretched down a corridor long enough to hold 100 stories nobody would ever hear. Natalie moved through it with the kind of invisible precision that made older nurses stop and watch. Not because she was fast, though she was, but because her hands never wavered. A 22-gauge for needle slid into a subclavian line with the fluid grace of someone who had done it under conditions that would make most surgeons quit medicine. Long sleeves covered her forearms. Beneath the cotton, shrapnel scars mapped the landscape of a valley in Iraq that she no longer thought about except at 3 a.m. when her 8-year-old daughter was finally asleep. The folded flag sat in her locker on the 3rd shelf, wrapped in sterile gauze like a relic. Sergeant Marcus Webb. 22 years old. Weapon sergeant. He didn't make it out of Tikrit. She touched it before every shift, a ritual that took for seconds and required no one to witness it. This morning, like every morning, her fingers found the flag in the darkness of her locker, and she pressed it against her forehead. Pain is data. Pain is information. The tremor in her chest wasn't fear. It was restraint. By 7:15 a.m., she was on the cardiac unit proper. Bedford held a young Marine, probably early 20s, with a chest tube and a look in his eyes that told her he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to see. Captain Derek Holloway. His chart said he was here for post-operative monitoring following emergency thoracic surgery, a routine 5-day stay for a kid who'd caught shrapnel in Sanjin Valley and lived. His vitals were stable. His color was good. His eyes followed her hands as she adjusted his for drip with a precision that seemed like overkill for a routine medication flush. You tied off that bleeder in Tikrit, didn't you? His voice was barely a whisper. I was with the army unit that came in after. We heard about it. The Angel of Tikrit. Nobody knew the name. Just heard you were Air Force. Saw the scar on your hand when you were carrying someone to the halo. Natalie's hands didn't stop moving. The foot drip settled into its new rhythm. 60 milliliters per hour. She met his eyes with a silence that confirmed everything, then returned to her work as if he'd commented on the weather. No tremble. No flinch. No acknowledgement. Just the sound of the heart monitor's steady beep, 94 beats per minute, sinus rhythm, normal, and the whisper of her shoes on tile as she moved to the next patient without another word. That was the moment Dr. Mercer saw her. He stood in the doorway of Bedford at 7:22 a.m., his tablet glowing with the kind of institutional authority that only hospital administrators can carry. His white coat was pressed with the precision of someone who believed clothing was power. Behind him, the corridor stretched empty and sterile, and his eyes moved across Natalie's figure with the slow calculation of a man cataloging evidence. She was spending unauthorized time with patients. 7 minutes with Holloway. He noted it. Her badge, the one she'd been required to replace 3 weeks ago, clicked against her chest as she moved past him. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just a nurse doing her job with hands that had some kind of peculiar steadiness. Some kind of focus that seemed wrong. Excessive. The kind of attention that suggested she cared too much about outcomes instead of efficiency metrics. Dr. Mercer had been at St. Michael's for 14 years. He'd built his reputation on 3 things: impeccable documentation, institutional loyalty, and an ability to identify problems before they became liabilities. Natalie Hayes had been a problem for 3 months now. Not a big one. Nothing he could document formally yet. Just small infractions. Restocking supplies outside the designated inventory protocol. Spending extra time with patients when other nurses moved faster. Using the automated medication dispenser in the wrong sequence, alphabetical instead of by priority order. Tiny violations that added up like poison in small doses. His tablet made a soft electronic chirp as he opened a new note. October 14th. 7:22 a.m. Observed RN Hayes in Bedford with Marine patient, Captain Derek Holloway, for approximately 7 minutes. Extended patient contact without documented clinical justification. Appears to exceed standard care protocols. Recommend observation of future interactions. It wasn't much. Not yet. But it was a start. Natalie felt his presence in the way soldiers feel proximity to threats they haven't consciously registered. Her peripheral vision caught the slight movement of his stylus against the tablet screen. The tap-tap-tap of documentation beginning. She'd seen this pattern before, not in hospitals, but in forward operating bases where majors and colonels had decided that younger soldiers posed some kind of undefined risk. The pattern was always the same. Watch. Document. Question. Isolate. She didn't stop what she was doing. Her hands continued their work with the precision of someone who had already learned that survival required invisibility. By 7:45 a.m., she was in the supply room on the 4th floor, restocking central line kits. The shelves ran 15 feet high, organized by her own system, not the official one, but one that made sense to hands that had organized surgical equipment in the back of a C-130 at 35,000 feet. One box belonged on the 3rd shelf, 2nd from the left. Hospital protocol said 2nd shelf, 4th from the right. She put it where it belonged, where someone needing it in a crisis could find it without reading a laminated instruction sheet. Her tactical knowledge of spatial organization would become a problem for her career in about 90 days. At 8:03 a.m., Dr. Mercer walked past the supply room and observed her placing supplies in incorrect positions. His tablet made another soft chirp. Another note. Another data point. By the time he finished his rounds at 9:48 a.m., he would have filled 3 screens with observations. By the end of the week, he would have enough for a preliminary incident report. By the end of the month, he would have built a file thick enough to request a meeting with hospital HR. But that wasn't the worst part. Holloway was still in bed for when she returned, and his eyes found hers immediately with the recognition of someone who'd been through something together. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words carrying weight they shouldn't have carried for a simple medication adjustment and vital sign check. "For what you did. For all of it." Natalie checked his monitors. Heart rate holding steady. O2 sat at 97. Respirations calm and even. Everything normal. Everything invisible. She pressed the call button to confirm he was comfortable, noted it in his chart, and moved to the next patient with the same mechanical precision she'd maintained since her boots hit the tarmac at Norfolk International 5 years ago. But her hands, for just a moment, held a memory of Tikrit that pain couldn't quite erase. Dr. Mercer was already 3 steps ahead. By lunch, he would have scheduled a preliminary meeting with the director of nursing. By dinner, he would have photocopied every occurrence report filed in the past 6 months, searching for patterns. By midnight, he would have begun to build something he believed was a case. He had no idea what he was really building. He had no idea that the woman he'd just observed in the supply room had been decorated for valor under circumstances he would never understand. He had no idea that in exactly 5 years, someone would arrive at St. Michael's in dress blues, and everything would change. The presentation room at St. Michael's held the hum of institutional power, fluorescent panels casting a clinical sameness over 20 residents and for attending physicians arranged in tiered rows like an audience assembled for judgment. Dr. Mercer stood at the lectern, Natalie Hayes' patient chart held aloft the way a prosecutor might brandish evidence of a crime. His voice carried the precision of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "This is a textbook example of excessive documentation," he announced, his tone suggesting he'd discovered proof of hospital fraud. Nurse Hayes has written 4 pages about a routine post-operative vitals check. 4 pages. Do we bill by the word now, or is this simply theatrical record-keeping? Laughter rippled through the room, the comfortable laughter of people in positions of unquestioned authority. Natalie stood against the back wall in her scrubs, observing. Her jaw clenched imperceptibly, the only tell in a face that had learned long ago not to reveal what lived beneath it. She'd been trained by people whose job was to notice micro-expressions in hostile rooms, and she'd learned her own expressions needed to reveal nothing. Her hands, scarred from years of trauma work and older work that couldn't be discussed, hung at her sides with the stillness of a soldier at rest. Perhaps our clipboard crusader believes she's authoring a medical thriller rather than completing a chart, Mercer continued, tapping the pages with theatrical disappointment. This consumes physician review time. It burdens our electronic systems. It's wasteful. He glanced toward the back of the room, where Natalie stood, ensuring everyone understood who the subject of ridicule was. Hospital administration has asked me to address documentation standards. This is what we're trying to prevent. Nobody mentioned that those 4 pages had flagged a pharmacy error, a post-op patient receiving morphine despite a documented allergy listed somewhere in the paper chart but missed in the electronic handoff. Nobody mentioned the medication interaction she'd caught the same week, a duplicate statin dose that could have caused rhabdomyolysis. Natalie had caught both errors and reported them through channels, quietly, without drawing attention to the system failures that created the danger in the first place. But efficient silence didn't make for compelling teaching moments. The presentation ended. Residents filed out murmuring to each other, the hierarchy of hospital authority already settling back into place, doctors at the top, nurses somewhere below, documentation either a protective barrier or a target, depending on who was holding the weapon. Later that afternoon, Natalie approached the vending machines in the main hallway. She needed water. It was a small thing. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and the faint metallic edge of the blood bank 2 doors down. Her badge, displaying only her name and RN credential, nothing of the clearance levels that existed in databases she couldn't access from civilian systems, clipped to her pocket as she walked. Dr. Mercer stood near the machines with 2 attending physicians, their conversation positioned at precisely the volume that carries naturally down a hospital corridor. His voice rose as she approached. If Nurse Hayes can't follow simple cafeteria schedules, she took lunch at 1:33 instead of the designated 1:30, perhaps security should escort her to time management training. He said this as though speaking to his colleagues about an observation, though every word was directed backward, calibrated for the ears of the woman now within 10 feet of him. The attendings exchanged smirks, the visible pleasure of people watching someone else being humiliated by proxy. Natalie selected water from the machine. She fed in $2. The machine whirred and dispensed her bottle. She picked it up and continued toward the nurse's station without breaking stride, without acknowledgement, without the slightest tremor in her movement. Her military composure was invisible beneath the scrubs, but it was there, the kind of calm that comes not from confidence but from having already survived worse. Pain is data. Humiliation is data. Insults are data to be filed away and processed without emotional response. The nurse's station occupied a horseshoe-shaped desk at the center of the cardiac unit's core, banks of monitors displaying the electrical activity of 30 sleeping hearts. Natalie placed her water bottle beside her computer terminal and began reviewing afternoon labs. Her colleague Derek, a respiratory therapist with kind eyes and no idea what he was witnessing, sat across from her charting event setting. "He's really coming for you," Derek said quietly, not looking up from his screen. "I know," Natalie replied. She didn't ask how he knew. Hospital politics moved through the building like weather systems, visible to anyone paying attention. The next morning, an incident report appeared in her personnel file. Natalie discovered it while checking her email. The report documented her unauthorized supply restocking, flagged that she'd refilled crash cart supplies immediately following a code blue instead of waiting for the designated restocking hour at 4 p.m. Hospital Protocol subsection 3.4.2 was cited. 2 photographs were attached showing the timestamps on her badge swipes. It was meticulous work, methodical, the documentation of a man building a case one brick at a time, each brick placed carefully, each brick verifiable. Another report followed 3 days later. This one addressed excessive patient contact time. She had spent 12 minutes with a dying veteran in room 418 instead of the protocol-mandated 8 minutes per patient interaction. The report included a statement from a nurse who'd observed the encounter, notarized, official. The veteran had been 94 years old and alert, his daughter present via video call, his wife holding his hand. Natalie had stayed through his final breath, had been present for the moment his chest stilled, had documented his time of death and called his family back to the phone to deliver the news herself because she understood that death deserves witnesses and that dying people deserve someone to stay. But staying was protocol violation. Compassion was documentation liability. She filed the reports in a folder she kept at home, the one underneath her bed next to the carefully preserved flag folded in a triangle, the flag that had draped the casket of her weapons sergeant in Tikrit 5 years earlier. She didn't respond to them. Responding would only give Mercer material to work with. The smartest move was invisibility. The smartest move was accepting that some battles couldn't be won through official channels, that sometimes survival meant staying quiet until it was time to move. But that wasn't the worst part of what was coming. The next Tuesday, the cardiac unit received a transfer from the ER, a civilian contractor, 52 years old, admitted for minor chest discomfort and scheduled for observation. Natalie saw him in Bay 7, connected to monitors, his EKG showing only mild ST elevation and nothing that seemed immediately life-threatening. By mid-afternoon, she was restocking the crash cart from the supply room when the monitor alarms began screaming in unison, a sound like electronic panic, penetrating and urgent. She was 10 feet away when she saw it, the contractor's chest wall moving asymmetrically, his left side static while his right side rose and fell with frantic breathing effort. His lips had already begun turning the particular shade of blue that meant oxygen was no longer reaching his blood effectively. Tracheal deviation. Absent breath sounds on the left. The clinical picture resolved into certainty in her mind before anyone else in the unit had fully processed what the alarms meant. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against the heart. The code team was 3 floors down in the ER. Response time, 2 to 3 minutes. The patient's usable oxygen, 90 seconds, maybe less. Dr. Mercer stood in the doorway of nearby room 409, chart in hand, watching the chaos with the detached observation of someone not yet emotionally invested. Natalie moved. She crossed the distance to the crash cart in 3 seconds, her hands moving on their own through the muscle memory of a different place, a different time, under different skies. She opened the emergency airway kit. 14-gauge needle, angiocath, the kind of tool that saves lives when used in the 40-second window where it still matters. She knelt beside the contractor's stretcher, her fingers finding the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark that had been drilled into her during training that nobody at St. Michael's knew she'd received. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. Just like Tikrit. Just like the Marine who'd taken shrapnel in his chest cavity and had stopped panicking the moment she'd decompressed him. The contractor's oxygen saturation began climbing. 68, 72, 79, his color returned. His breathing synchronized with actual air moving in and out of functioning lungs. The code team arrived 90 seconds later to find him stable, alert, the emergency already resolved. Natalie was calmly documenting the intervention on the bedside chart, her notes precise and objective: needle decompression, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, 2.5 centimeters depth, immediate return of breath sounds and O2 saturation improvement to 95% on supplemental oxygen. Dr. Mercer stepped into the hallway. His expression remained neutral. He stood for approximately 15 seconds watching her work, and in those 15 seconds, something shifted behind his eyes, a recalibration of threat assessment. That evening, a formal complaint arrived on official board of nursing letterhead, addressed to Natalie, copied to hospital administration, the credential office, and the state medical board. Dr. Mercer had filed it personally. The document ran 17 pages. It cited hospital policy subsection 4.7.2 prohibiting nurses from performing emergency procedures outside their licensed scope of practice without direct physician supervision. It attached witness statements from 2 nurses who'd observed the needle decompression. It included a 40-year-old state regulation and 4 pages of legal precedent about nurse scope limitations. Every sentence was documented. Every regulation was cited with subsection numbers. Every witness statement was notarized. Natalie read it 3 times that night in her apartment, sitting at her kitchen table with the television off and her 8-year-old daughter sleeping in the next room. She understood what was happening. She understood that she'd made a critical error by revealing capability. She understood that Mercer had recognized something in those 40 seconds, not her identity, she was certain of that, but the recognition that she was not what she appeared to be, and that uncertainty made her dangerous to him, and dangerous people had to be removed. What she didn't know was that in exactly 3 days, a high-value patient being treated at St. Michael's under medical protection detail would take a turn for the worse, requiring emergency intervention. What she didn't know was that her suspension letter was already being prepared, her exit interview already scheduled. What she didn't know was that a Marine colonel recovering from wounds sustained in Tikrit 5 years earlier was about to arrive in Norfolk for follow-up surgery, and the moment he heard about a nurse being fired from the cardiac unit, he was going to start making phone calls. What she didn't know was that she'd spent 5 years in deep cover gathering intelligence on Mercer's phantom surgical billing, $3.2 million in fraudulent Medicare claims, and that her suspension would trigger a federal audit that was already primed and waiting for her clearance to proceed. But tonight, she was simply a nurse sitting at her kitchen table with a board of nursing complaint in her hands, and the weight of everything she couldn't say settled across her shoulders like gravity with a specific address. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. The cardiac unit at St. Michael's in Norfolk erupts without warning at 2:27 p.m. on a Tuesday. A contractor, mid-50s, clipboard still in his hand, staggers past the nurse's station, his face the color of wet concrete. His right chest wall moves inward on each breath, the opposite of what it should do. Paradoxical movement. His lips are already turning blue. Natalie sees him first. She's filing discharge papers when she recognizes the signs, the asymmetrical breathing, the panic rising in his eyes like water in a sinking ship, the way his free hand clutches at his ribs as if pressure alone could make his lungs work again. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung pressing against his heart, suffocating him from the inside. She's seen this exact pathology before. Not in a textbook. Under mortar fire in Tikrit, a sergeant from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines bleeding out while his own body turned against him. She doesn't wait. She doesn't call the code team. Muscle memory takes over. She moves toward him, already reaching for the nearest crash cart. The cardiac monitor is 3 steps away. Defibrillator pads. Airway kit. But what she needs is immediate. A 14-gauge needle. Angiocath. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The same spot she'd accessed under desert sun with round snapping overhead and a radio screaming casualty reports. Her hands know the anatomy better than her brain knows her own name. The contractor staggers into the hallway. Nurses freeze. A resident nearby mumbles something about waiting for the attending. The man's oxygen saturation is dropping, she can see it on the monitor cart wheeling past. 88, 82. 76, at this rate, cardiac arrest in 90 seconds. She's already moving. The needle is in her hand. She doesn't remember grabbing it, the way soldiers don't remember pulling a trigger in combat. The decision is made by muscle and training and the specific moment when hesitation costs lives. She pushes through to him, positioning herself at his right side, her left hand finding the intercostal space with the precision of a surgeon who's performed this procedure on living patients, not cadavers. I need him on his back. Now. Her voice drops an octave. Not a request. Not phrasing it as a question. The contractor drops. She's already moving. Her right hand finds the needle, 14 gauge, cold steel that tastes like iron when you've held it this long, and she positions it perpendicular to his chest wall, the angle exactly calibrated from 5 years of classified field work and 8 years before that in active service. Her jaw sets. Her breath steadies. The trembling isn't fear. It's restraint. The needle slides in. One smooth motion. The angle, the depth, the pressure, all of it muscle memory encoded in her body from a decade of carrying casualties. 2 inches, maybe 3. She feels the resistance shift. The fascia gives. And then, the hiss of air escaping. Pressurized air from a collapsed lung, the sound of breath that shouldn't be there, the noise of a body in crisis finally exhaling what's been crushing it from inside. It's a sound like a tire puncture, like relief, like the specific moment when death backs away by 1 second. O2 sat climbing. One of the nurses, voice shaking. 88, 92, 97. The contractor's chest is already moving more symmetrically. The paradoxical breathing stops. His skin color shifts from concrete gray toward something almost human. His eyes focus. He's not dying anymore. His left hand grabs at her sleeve, not in panic now but in gratitude, in the wordless thanks of a man who just felt his body start working again. 40 seconds. That's all it took. Dr. Mercer stands in the doorway. She sees him in her peripheral vision, the way a combat vet sees threat assessment without turning her head. His expression is calcified. His hand is already reaching for his phone. He watches her withdraw the needle with the same steady precision she used to insert it, watches her apply direct pressure to the puncture site, watches the contractor's oxygen saturation climb to 99 as actual air begins flowing into functional lungs instead of crushing the organs beneath his ribs. The cardiac resident is already moving, late, predictable, the kind of hesitation that kills people in the first 3 seconds of a crisis. Natalie steps back. She's already done what needed doing. The machinery of the hospital takes over. They'll get him to radiology for a chest X-ray. They'll order a tube. They'll follow protocol. The crisis is over because she moved before the protocols could grind into motion. That evening, Natalie is in the break room finishing her shift when her phone buzzes. An email from hospital administration. Board of Nursing. Investigation. Subject, unauthorized practice of medicine, scope of practice violation, emergency procedure performed without physician oversight or authorization. The complaint is 6 pages. Subsection 4.7.2 is quoted twice. Dr. Mercer has attached witness statements, other nurses, all of them dated today, all of them describing what they saw with the careful precision of people who understand they're being asked to validate a narrative. He's invoked a regulation from the 1980s, back when emergency needle decompression wasn't recognized as a life-saving intervention but rather as operating room-only procedure that nurses had no authority to attempt under any circumstance, even if the patient was dying in the hallway and the attending physician was 3 floors away in surgery. It's competent sabotage. It's institutional weaponization. It's strategic destruction dressed in the language of patient safety and professional standards. He's not yelling anymore. He's using the hospital's own bureaucracy as a knife. Natalie reads the complaint while standing in the break room, a coffee cooling in the microwave behind her. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. The complaint details her actions as dangerous, reckless, outside the scope of nursing practice, potentially harmful to patient welfare despite apparent immediate survival. It requests immediate Board of Nursing investigation and recommends suspension pending administrative review. She doesn't set the email down. She doesn't cry. She doesn't tremble. Her jaw tightens imperceptibly, and she closes the email and returns to charting. She finishes her documentation on the contractor, vital stable, transferred to cardiothoracic for chest tube placement, prognosis excellent. She signs off. She logs out. She removes her badge. The next morning, certified mail arrives. Her hands are steady when she opens it. The letter confirms suspension effective immediately. Pending board review. No access to hospital premises except for the mandatory exit interview scheduled for 9 a.m. the following day. Her badge is to be surrendered. All patient information access is revoked. The letterhead is crisp. The language is formal. The destruction is absolute. The exit interview lasts 17 minutes. HR asks questions in a monotone. Had she ever received training on scope of practice limitations? Yes. Was she aware of hospital policy for point 7.2? Yes. Did she perform a needle decompression on the contractor? Yes. Were there specific circumstances you felt justified this action? She answers, patient was in cardiac distress. Immediate intervention was required. They write it down. They don't ask follow-up questions. They don't need to. The narrative is already written. They accept her badge. They accept her key card. They walk her to her locker. She changes out of her scrubs for the last time in 5 years. The locker smells like antiseptic and the ghost of every shift she's worked in this facility. On the top shelf, buried under a spare uniform, sits a folded flag, the one the weapons sergeant from her unit sent her 3 years ago, the one from a man named Torres who didn't make it out of Tikrit, the one she keeps hidden because carrying it to work would be evidence that contradicts her entire cover identity. She doesn't touch it today. She closes the locker. She walks out of St. Michael's at 9:11 a.m. The parking lot is silent except for the sound of her car door closing. She sits in the driver's seat for 20 minutes without starting the engine. The steering wheel is warm from the sun. The hospital rises behind her like a monument to everything she sacrificed and lost in the span of a single 40-second procedure. But that wasn't the worst part. That night, when she walks through her front door in Norfolk, she finds her 8-year-old daughter Emma sitting on the kitchen steps, her small face confused and worried in equal measure. Emma runs to her, and Natalie lifts her without speaking, without explanation. She carries her to the kitchen table and sits down, still in her street clothes, still smelling like hospital air. 2 hours later, Emma finds her there. Just sitting. Staring at nothing. The folded flag from Tikrit is on the table in front of her, creases sharp as knife edges, the fabric worn from being held through 5 years of classified silence. Natalie's hands are folded around it, and her shoulders are shaking in a way they never shake in public, in a way that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the weight of being invisible while doing the visible work of saving lives. Mommy. Emma's voice is small and uncertain. Why are you home? Natalie can't answer. She reaches out and pulls her daughter close, and Emma doesn't ask again. Children know when the explanation isn't available. They learn to sit in silence with the people they love. That night, at 11:23 p.m., her secure phone rings. No caller ID. Just vibration and silence and the specific frequency that means intelligence handlers on a classified line. She answers. She listens. 3 sentences in, her composure transforms completely. The Air Force colonel, the one she'd pulled from rubble outside Fallujah, the one whose injuries kept him classified and protected, the one whose recovery had brought him to St. Michael's in the first place to make sure she could monitor his progress, he was being transferred to St. Michael's for final clearance in 72 hours. High-value asset. Final evaluation. The mission required her presence. But she'd just been suspended. What's my status? She asked quietly. Complicated, her handler said. We're working on it. She hung up. She stood in her kitchen at 11:26 p.m. She looked at the folded flag. She looked at Emma sleeping on the couch in the living room. She looked at the suspension letter on the counter, at the board of nursing investigation that was supposed to end her career, at the institutional machinery that Dr. Mercer had set in motion to destroy her credibility and her access. And she made a decision that no suspended nurse should ever make. But suspended nurses don't usually have classified missions requiring them to be somewhere in 72 hours. Suspended nurses don't usually have Pentagon liaisons working phone calls at midnight. Suspended nurses don't usually carry military rank beneath their scrubs. The certified mail envelope arrived at 3:36 p.m. on a Tuesday, the kind with the signature requirement that made it official. Natalie stood in the St. Michael's parking lot under a sky the color of concrete, the letter crisp in her hands. Her eyes moved across the words, suspension pending Board of Nursing investigation, effective immediately, all hospital privileges revoked, return badge and credentials by end of business day. The paper didn't tremble. Her breathing didn't change. She folded it once, then again, her movements precise as a surgical knot, and tucked it into her scrub pocket where her fingers had spent 5 years adjusting patient lines and catching medication errors no one else would notice. A nurse walking past glanced at her. Natalie's face gave nothing away. The military composure was still there, the invisible armor, the discipline that said nothing had broken because nothing could break what was already fortified with 5 tours worth of compartmentalization. She'd been suspended from 3 different countries. This was just another one. The exit interview was scheduled for 15 p.m. on the 3rd floor in hospital administration. Natalie changed back into civilian clothes in the employee locker room, moving through the motions like she was packing gear before a deployment. The locker door closed quietly. She didn't slam anything. She didn't punch anything. She just turned and walked toward the elevators with the same unhurried pace she'd used walking away from Tikrit, one foot in front of the other, breathing steady, eyes forward. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. A resident she recognized from Grand Round stood in the corner, suddenly very interested in his shoes. Natalie didn't acknowledge him. The doors closed. The hospital administrator was a woman named Patricia Wells, 62, with the kind of sympathy in her eyes that made everything worse than anger would have. She had Dr. Mercer's complaint laid out in chronological order, each incident documented, cross-referenced, notarized. The unauthorized time with patients. The excessive documentation. The needle decompression performed outside scope of practice. The email chain of complaints from other attending physicians. Patricia Wells kept saying she was sorry, kept saying this was hospital policy, kept saying the Board of Nursing would make the final determination, but the suspension was precautionary, standard procedure, nothing personal. Natalie signed the termination paperwork with the same signature she'd used on combat casualty reports. Her hands were steady. Her voice when she spoke was quiet. "I understand." 2 words. That was all Patricia Wells got. The administrator seemed to want to say more, seemed to want Natalie to fight, to cry, to react like a normal person who'd just lost her job, but Natalie stood, thanked her for her time, and walked out of the office at 4:34 p.m. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. The drive home took 18 minutes from the hospital. Natalie sat in traffic on Military Highway, watching the brake lights ahead of her stretch like a river of red, and didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car felt like the silence before missions, that specific kind of quiet where your own heartbeat is the loudest thing you can hear. Rain started on I-64, light at first, then heavier, drumming the windshield in a rhythm that reminded her of mortar fire. Not the same, never the same, but the body remembers patterns. She kept her hands at 10 and 2. She kept her eyes on the road. She didn't cry. She wouldn't cry. Not in the car. Not until she was home. Not until she was alone. The house was empty when she got there. Her daughter was at aftercare, would be picked up at 6. Natalie had 2 hours before she'd have to explain why Mommy came home early, why there was no more hospital, why everything had just collapsed into silence. She walked into the kitchen and sat at the table, the same table where they'd done homework that morning, where her daughter had drawn a picture of the 2 of them with the sun between them. The chair was solid. Real. Natalie put her hands flat on the surface and stared at nothing for 17 minutes. Then something broke. Not her composure, the military training was too good for that, too practiced, but the seal around everything she'd been holding. The tears came without permission, without warning, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. She reached for the small wooden box on the shelf above the refrigerator where she kept the things that couldn't be explained. The box was walnut, hand-carved, and inside was a folded flag the size of a closed fist. Her weapon sergeant. Tikrit. 2018, he'd been a sniper, best shot she'd ever seen, could read wind patterns like they were written in a language only he understood. She'd tried to save him anyway, after the IED. She'd tried so hard. But some things can't be sutured. Some losses are permanent. She pulled the flag from the box and held it in both hands, and the crying came harder then, not because of the job or the suspension or Dr. Mercer's complaint, but because everything she'd sacrificed, every day spent as just a nurse, every humiliation swallowed, every mission completed in silence, had just been stripped away. 5 years of being nobody. 5 years of hiding a captain's rank beneath hospital scrubs and psychiatric medications prescribed for PTSD she wasn't actually experiencing but needed the cover story for. 5 years of watching the people she loved from a distance because distance kept them safe. That's when she heard the car in the driveway. Early. Too early. Only one person picked up from aftercare at 4:52 p.m. on a random Tuesday, and that person was 8 years old and would want to know why Mommy wasn't at work. Natalie wiped her face in exactly 3 seconds. The tears stopped. The composure came back like flipping a switch. She'd had a lot of practice at this. She set the folded flag on the table where her hands could still touch it, and she sat still, breathing, listening to the car door open and small feet running toward the house. Her daughter burst into the kitchen with the kind of enthusiasm only 8-year-olds could manage, asking about her day, asking if they could make cookies, asking why Mommy was home early with her eyes all red like she'd been crying, which was weird because Mommy never cried. "Bad day at work, honey," Natalie said, and it wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the entire truth. Some things didn't go the way we wanted. She couldn't explain about classified missions or Pentagon protections or the detained combatant schedule to arrive at St. Michael's in 72 hours for emergency surgery, couldn't explain that she'd been suspended but was about to be reinstated in a hearing that would expose everything. She couldn't tell her daughter that the person who looked like a regular mom at this kitchen table was actually a captain in the Air Force with orders she couldn't disobey and secrets she couldn't share and a folded flag on the table representing everything that never gets discussed. She pulled her daughter close instead, the small body fitting against her chest the way it always had, and she breathed in the smell of school, chalk and playground dirt and the strawberry shampoo she used. "I'm still here," Natalie whispered. "No matter what happens, I'm still here." Her daughter squeezed tighter, not understanding, and Natalie looked down at the folded flag on the table beside them. "We're going to be okay." She said it like a command, like an oath, like the kind of promise that gets written in scar tissue and sealed with everything a person has left to give. "I promise you, we're going to be okay." But she wasn't entirely sure she believed it, and the rain kept hammering against the windows like a countdown to something she couldn't stop. The rain kept hammering against the windows like a countdown to something she couldn't stop. Natalie sat in the darkness of her apartment, Emma finally asleep upstairs, the folded flag from Tikrit resting against her leg like a weight that had never lifted. She didn't know how to explain to an 8-year-old why heroes cry when nobody's watching. She didn't know that 72 hours would change everything. The phone rang at 2:38 a.m. Not her personal line. The other one. The burner she kept in the bottom of her locker behind the spare stethoscope, the Pentagon direct line that only worked in one direction, incoming. She answered without speaking. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, already moving on to the next briefing. "Captain Hayes. The asset is inbound. ETA Norfolk General, 71 hours. Your suspension is being addressed at federal level. Stay silent. Cooperation from local authorities pending." The line went dead. No questions. No goodbyes. The old brass never asked if you were ready. They assumed you already were. By 6:11 a.m., 3 figures in dark suits walked through the administrative offices of St. Michael's carrying federal warrant documents printed on cream-colored paper. They found Dr. Mercer in his office reviewing surgical schedules, still operating under the assumption that Natalie's suspension was his victory, her humiliation his final word. The silence when they entered the room lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the lead agent placed the warrant on his mahogany desk. "Dr. James Mercer. We're here to secure all surgical records from the past 6 years. Step away from the computer." It wasn't a request. It was a command. 2 agents moved toward the filing cabinets while the third stood with his hand resting on his belt, the position that said this conversation was already over. Mercer's face cycled through denial, confusion, and finally something that looked like understanding, the moment when a man realizes he's been building a trap around himself. "This is preposterous. I demand to know what this is about." His voice had lost its weight. In that moment, standing beside his desk as federal agents began boxing his files into evidence bags, Dr. Mercer sounded like exactly what he was, a bully caught with his hand in the till, suddenly very small. The lead agent didn't answer. He just kept signing chain of custody forms while his colleagues photographed the office. One of them found a USB drive hidden in Mercer's desk drawer, encrypted, password protected, and absolutely damning. The agent looked at it like he'd found a confession written in Mercer's own handwriting. He probably had. People like Mercer always documented their crimes. They thought documentation protected them. They never understood that it was a rope they were tying around their own throats. By that afternoon, the Board of Nursing had received a federal letter. The investigation into Natalie Hayes was suspended immediately. The investigation into Dr. James Mercer's use of hospital complaint procedures as a weapon against a whistleblower was opened immediately. Someone in the administrative offices whispered the word fraud. Someone else whispered the number 2.3 million. By evening, those whispers had become official. By midnight, they had become charges. The forensic accountants worked through the night. They found the pattern like archaeologists uncovering layers. Mercer had been submitting surgical billing codes for procedures that never happened, using real patient names pulled from the hospital system, fabricating OR time sheets, inventing complications that required extended recovery. The shell company, registered to his brother-in-law in Maryland, received 47% of the reimbursements. The rest went into accounts Mercer controlled through a casino in Atlantic City and a private equity firm in Delaware. It was the kind of fraud that looked almost professional until you started looking at the actual surgeries and realized that the patient names matched real people admitted on the dates the surgery supposedly occurred, but the procedures described in the billing codes didn't exist in any of the actual surgical records. Mercer had been sloppy. Or arrogant. Or both. The accountants suspected both. But what they also found, buried in the hospital's documentation systems, was something else entirely. Notes. Observations. Entries in patient charts written in careful, detailed handwriting that belonged to a nurse who had been quietly documenting the inconsistencies between OR schedules and billing records, between patient histories and the procedures allegedly performed. The nurse who was supposedly wasting hospital resources with excessive documentation. The nurse Mercer had been systematically destroying. She had been seeing the pattern for months. Her thorough chart notes, the ones he mocked during grand rounds, were a record of every discrepancy she'd observed. If she had continued for 6 more weeks without interference, she would have connected every dot. So Mercer had needed to remove her before she could testify, before she could tell investigators what she'd been quietly noticing in the margins of 1,000 pages of hospital records. The building blocks had been there all along. Hospital Policy Subsection 4.7.2. Incident reports for minor infractions. A Board of Nursing investigation designed to bury her before the evidence trail led anywhere. It was strategy dressed up as bureaucracy. It was murder wearing a tie and carrying a briefcase. And it had failed because the federal government had been watching the asset Natalie was assigned to protect, and federal oversight brought auditors, and auditors found what a single nurse with thorough documentation had been trying to prove all along. Within 48 hours, Mercer's medical license was suspended pending criminal investigation. His attorney negotiated furiously to avoid prison time, full restitution, permanent surrender of his medical license, 5 years probation, surrender of all professional certifications. The hospital released a statement about cooperation with federal authorities. The local news ran a headline about fraud at St. Michael's. Nobody mentioned that a nurse in scrubs had caught it first. Nobody mentioned that a nurse with excessive documentation had been trying to tell them for months. Natalie watched from the cardiac unit as they escorted him out on Thursday morning. His white coat had been confiscated as evidence. His tablet was gone. His surgeon's hands, which had never actually performed the surgeries he billed for, looked strange without instruments. An agent walked beside him, not quite restraining but definitely not allowing him any choices about which direction to walk. He passed the nurse's station without looking up. He passed the vending machine where he'd announced her need for time management training. He passed the spot where he'd stood during grand rounds, using her chart notes to lecture residents about wasteful documentation. His jaw was clenched so tight his face looked like a fist. The observation room where he'd watched her perform emergency decompression was being photographed for evidence. The OR where his phantom surgeries had been billed was being audited. The voice he'd used to tell the board of nursing that she was practicing outside her scope was being recorded as a witness statement in his own prosecution. And somewhere in a federal facility in Washington, Natalie's classified file was being updated with a notation about her role in uncovering the fraud. Nothing official. Nothing that would ever appear in a hospital record. Just a footnote in a document that very few people would ever read, confirming what a few people already knew. 6 months passed. The kind of time that heals some wounds and scars others permanently. Natalie returned to St. Michael's under federal order, her suspension expunged, her record cleared, her position restored with a stipulation that she could not be reassigned, demoted, or questioned about her documentation practices. She worked the cardiac unit with the kind of composure that comes from surviving something most people can't imagine. The same doctors who had watched Mercer humiliate her now nodded respectfully when she walked past. The same residents who had listened to his lectures about her excessive documentation now requested her for their supervision. The hospital installed a plaque in the break room honoring her work. She didn't acknowledge it. But one afternoon, a resident mentioned in passing that someone had spotted Dr. Mercer at Norfolk Community College, teaching CPR fundamentals for $18 an hour. The resident thought it was funny. She didn't. She thought about the arc of it, from chief of staff to hourly wages. From wielding hospital policy like a weapon to demonstrating chest compressions to students half his age who didn't know his name. From destroying people to teaching people how to save lives. The irony was so heavy it could sink ships. She imagined him standing in a community college gymnasium, instructing teenagers on the mechanics of cardiac resuscitation, knowing that every technique he taught, he had once used to destroy a captain who was only trying to save lives. Pain is data, she thought. His is too. The morning of the dedication ceremony arrived clear and bright, the kind of Norfolk day where the sun hits the water at the harbor like someone cracking open a door to another world. Natalie stood in her service dress uniform, captain's bars polished to mirror shine, silver star and bronze star pin below her name tape. Emma sat in the front row in a white dress, finally old enough to understand some of what she was seeing, not old enough to understand all of it. The folded flag from Tikrit rested in a shadow box beside a bronze plaque that read, in honor of Captain Natalie Hayes, whose service in combat and dedication to patients exemplifies the highest ideals of military medicine. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen stood at the podium in his Air Force Class A uniform, promoted since his recovery, no longer the wounded Marine she'd been assigned to protect but a colonel now, still bearing the scars from Tikrit, still grateful beyond words. He'd spent 5 years searching for the woman who pulled him from the dirt when his lungs had already started failing, who kept him alive through a convoy that took fire twice, whose hands had been steady when everything else was chaos. I came to this hospital because I needed a specific cardiac surgeon, Colonel Chen said into the microphone. I didn't know I would find the person I've been looking for since 2019. 5 years. That's how long I've been trying to track down the combat medic who saved my life in Tikrit. Turns out she was here the whole time, working the cardiac unit, doing documentation so thorough it caught a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, being undermined by someone who didn't understand what he was looking at. He paused. When you stand next to extraordinary people long enough, you start to think they're ordinary. That's how she almost disappeared. Natalie didn't move. Her posture remained perfect. Her eyes remained forward. But her hands, the hands that had performed emergency decompression at 40 seconds, that had documented every discrepancy with military precision, that had held folded flags and typed patient notes and kept people alive through things that should have killed them, her hands trembled exactly once, for less than a second. Emma saw it. Emma reached over and held one of those hands steady. The applause started in the back and moved forward like a wave. Hospital staff. Residents. Surgeons. Nurses who had watched her work without knowing what she'd survived. The staff member who delivered her suspension letter was clapping. The resident who'd laughed at her excessive documentation was clapping. The hospital administrator who'd signed the termination was clapping. Dr. Mercer's empty chair would have fit perfectly in this room, but instead there was just the echo of where he'd been and the sound of people finally understanding what they'd been standing next to all along. Colonel Chen stepped down from the podium and shook her hand. Not a military salute. A civilian handshake, the kind that said they were no longer officer and enlisted, just two people who'd been to the same war and come back changed. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I never knew your name then." "That was the mission, sir," she replied. Her voice had dropped an octave from the one she used in her nurse role. This voice was different. This voice carried rank. A reporter pushed through the crowd with a camera crew. "Captain Hayes, can you give us a statement about what it means to have your service finally recognized?" Natalie considered the question. She considered the 5 years of hiding. She considered the folded flag. She considered Dr. Mercer teaching CPR at $18 an hour. She considered her daughter's hand in hers. She considered what true heroism actually meant when nobody was watching to give you medals for it. "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching," she said. The camera flashes went off like artillery. Colonel Chen saluted one final time, his hand rising to his brow in the gesture that said she had always been an officer, always been a warrior, always been someone worth remembering. The mission was complete. The world was finally watching. And somewhere in a community college gymnasium, a disgraced surgeon was teaching compressions to students who would never know that every technique he demonstrated came from the hands of a captain who had done it better under mortar fire. If you're settling in for a good story, you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what time of day it is where you are. Let's get back to it.